Alright, guys, so I'm currently working on an alternate history scenario. What would have happened if Ronald Reagan won the presidency in 1976 instead of when he actually won it in 1980? So, how different would the world be today if the Reagan Revolution happened 4 years earlier than it ended up being? Because remember, 1976, the Republican primary was very, very, very close between Ronald Reagan and the incumbent president Gerald Ford. This is the strongest primary challenge that an incumbent president has faced in modern history. The 1980 Jimmy Carter had his own Democratic primary challenge, which may have affected his re-election prospects later on in November of 1980, and Reagan just obliterated Carter. But the thing that people don't seem to remember or understand about the 76 election, the real election between Carter and Ford, is that despite all the what was going on politically with Watergate and Ford pardoning Nixon and a lot of the mistakes that he made, saying there's no Soviet aggression in Eastern Europe. Those were like the three big mistakes that he made that may have cost him the election to Jimmy Carter. Despite all of that, it was a really close election. I mean, electorally, you can't see that, right? As far as the Electoral College goes, Carter had a pretty comfortable margin over Ford. But when we're talking about the actual popular vote, it was only within 2 percentage points between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. It was actually a really, really close election. Without Watergate, without all of that, Republicans probably would have continued to dominate U.S. politics for another 4 years into the 1980s. I mean, we could have seen a Republican era of domination that would have lasted almost as long as the Democratic Party's domination from the 1930s to the 60s. We could have seen Republican domination from the mid 70s until the 1990s, because really, when it came to in real life, it was the Republican Party dominating from 1980 till about the mid 90s, into the 2000s. Really, I mean, they've been, even though Democrats have won election and you had Bill Clinton and everything, Republicans have made serious gains from the 1980s through the early 2000s. So, what would have happened if Reagan won? Well, we'll talk about that another time. But let's actually talk about how that would have played out in an actual electoral situation, in an actual presidential election. So, as you can see, I replaced Ford's name with Ronald Reagan, and we're gonna play out an alternate scenario where Reagan does win election. First of all, he wins the primary against Ford. Ford concedes to Reagan. Potentially, you have a Reagan-Ford ticket, but I don't think Ford would have wanted to be president and then be vice president and ride on Reagan's coattails, even though he never really wanted to be president in the first place. It just didn't seem appropriate. Like, no matter what the circumstances are, having a former president as vice president, it really kind of undermines the job of the president. So Ford didn't really want to do that, and he probably never would have done that. But as far as Reagan's running mate, it could have been Bob Dole, but he definitely had to have some kind of moderate candidate to appeal to the moderate wing of the party, because Reagan was a little bit too far to the right for a lot of to the liking of many Republicans back in '76, and definitely him putting George H.W. Bush on his ticket in 1980 in the real world, in the real timeline, that definitely helped him unify the Republican Party in 1980 and 1984. So there's one thing I want to point your attention to, and that is the South right here. Carter did fantastic in the South. I mean, it was around that time where Republicans were starting to dominate. I mean, this was right after the 1968 realignment, where the people in the South actually started to identify as Republicans, while the South was pretty much dominated by the Democratic Party for over a century. But then it shifted over to the GOP. but Carter was able to kind of halt that trend and stop it from fully happening until Reagan in 1980. He did very well in the South. Well, why is that? Well, because he was from the South. He was from Georgia. And Ford was born in Nebraska, kind of got his name out there in the Midwest. And you think he would have done a little bit better. He won Michigan because that was basically his home state, or adopted state, you could say. But interestingly enough, in the 1976 primary, Nebraska was his home state. He was born there, even though that's not where he got his political career started. Reagan beat him in Nebraska in the actual primary. So, that's interesting. Interesting trivia for you. But that's really the only reason why Ford was even able to pick up this state. He probably would have lost Michigan too if it weren't for the fact that that's where he was from. So, overall, Carter did really well in the Midwest. He did amazing in the South. I mean, the Republicans didn't secure a single Southern state, unless you count Virginia as the South, which I guess you can, because Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy, and the Confederacy is typically associated with the South. I guess you could say that. But here's the thing. Reagan would have done a lot better in the South than Ford ended up doing if he was the Republican nominee instead of Ford. I want to point your attention to 1964. Okay, Barry Goldwater was one of the weakest candidates in presidential election history. I mean, he was a really weak candidate. It was at the point where Republicans were trying to figure out that it was, right before the realignment period, so they were trying to kind of rebrand itself, and Nixon refused to run again in 1964. So that, Nixon was also finding himself, and then he would run again in 1968 eventually and secure the presidency. But in 1964, Barry Goldwater was always a dark horse candidate. He was never really taken that seriously. But really what I've been talking about the realignment, about the Republican Party starting to take the South. I mean, Barry Goldwater was the first Republican to make significant gains in the South. Obviously, when it came to civil rights and all that, that probably has something to do with why Goldwater did so well in the South in 1964 specifically, because that's a very tumultuous time period in American politics. Very divisive. People think we're divisive now, and there's a lot of tension between different factions politically. I mean, this is nothing compared to what was going on in the 60s, and civil rights was definitely a big aspect of that. And the civil rights legislation that Johnson passed, I mean, the people in the South were pissed. I mean, they hated the idea of desegregation. They hated the idea of even the notion that African Americans could be viewed equally as the white majority, right? So yeah, that's probably honestly one of the main reasons why Goldwater was able to win. But remember, Ronald Reagan was a Goldwater Republican. That's where he got his name out there politically, by campaigning for Barry Goldwater, giving that speech. The first major political speech he gave was an advertisement for the Goldwater campaign. So he was a Goldwater Republican. And I point that out because I would say that if Reagan was the nominee over Ford in 1976, I wouldn't go as far as to say that he would win Georgia, because, I mean, obviously Georgia was Carter's home state, and he probably wouldn't have won all of these states in the South that he would have ended up winning in 1980. And also Texas, he would have done a little bit better in Texas, but I don't think he would have taken it. But as far as, I would say a state like Louisiana would have went for Reagan, because it is a state that Goldwater won in 1964. But also, in 1976, I mean, Ford wasn't loved by too many people in the South. That was the other thing, too, is that Ford was very weak. He didn't really appeal that much to Southern voters. He was really a Northern Republican and not a Southern Republican, because, I mean, this was really at a point where the Republicans first started making gains in the South. So he was really big in the Midwest, Ford. And I think Michigan really was a big reason why it flipped red, was him being from Michigan. So I would actually say that Carter would have ended up taking Michigan. So, okay, so Carter has an even bigger gain now, right? Well, okay. Look at 1964, Missouri, Alabama. Not Missouri, I'm sorry. Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and also Arizona, which the Republicans ended up winning anyway. But I would also say in the North, the Republicans might have also done a little bit better with Reagan, which sounds crazy because, wait, isn't he like a far-right nut job? But he also appealed to people in California. He also appealed, he was the governor of California. So he did kind of have that appeal across the aisle. If he didn't, he wouldn't have ended up having a political landslide in both 1980 and 1984. I mean, it wasn't even close. It was a massacre. He destroyed the Democrats. He had a 49-state landslide in 84. So if he was this right-wing nut job, obviously he moved further to the center as, he eased into the presidency. But I think there's a case to be made that he could have actually performed pretty well in these northern states. But we'll focus on the South for now. I think he could have taken Mississippi, Ronald Reagan. I think, Texas would have been really close. But I think he also could have done a lot better in Florida than Ford ended up doing. Because Florida was another really close election in 1976. And, Reagan might have been the one that could have motivated people, could have rallied people to vote for the Republicans that year, instead of Gerald Ford, who, was not elected, never elected to his office. He didn't really, motivate a lot of people. He wasn't good at rallying the Republican base because, well, he was never elected in the first place. So, that's another thing to keep in mind. And yeah, I mean, remember, Ford won New Jersey. So going back to the North, I think there's a good chance that Ronald Reagan could have done a lot better in Pennsylvania than Gerald Ford ended up doing, because a lot of those rural voters, especially. I mean, Reagan, his message could have appealed a lot to those people. So I would have given it to. I actually would give Pennsylvania to Ronald Reagan. He would have done a little bit better in the North, like I said. I think Massachusetts and New York would have been, it would have been a little bit more close than it ended up being. But I would still just keep those states for Carter. And it would have been a more narrow victory, but I would have it around here. And even if, let's say Carter wins Mississippi, right? And let's say also he just sweeps the entire South, which probably wouldn't have happened. I mean, Reagan's path would have been a lot easier than Ford, because he could have taken one state in the Midwest and he would have been above 270. You know what I mean? So no, I would still give Louisiana, and I would still give Mississippi. And this is what it would look like, something like that. Obviously, making an exact prediction for something that ended up not happening, which is Reagan securing the Republican nomination. Obviously you can't be too accurate when it comes to that, because who knows what would have happened, right? But I think this is a good way of looking at it. I think Carter would have still performed very well in the South. But then again, I mean, Reagan destroyed Carter in the South in the actual election, but I think Reagan was just starting to get his name out there, and it was also a bad time for Jimmy Carter, who the hostage crisis and the economic crisis with inflation and the energy crisis, I think those were also big factors that ended up hurting Carter in a lot of these southern states that didn't really have a lot of money and couldn't really sustain itself during the energy crisis and with inflation and everything. So those issues were very important to Southern voters. But, then again, Carter was also, he might have been religious and such, and Reagan was divorced and everything, and maybe the evangelical voters wouldn't have liked that very much. I still think that Reagan would have performed a little bit better in the South than Ford ended up doing. So that's why I would I would have it look something like this. He would have made significant gains across the entire country, not a specific region in the country, and it would have definitely been a lot closer between Carter and Reagan than it ended up being actually in 1980. But I want to know what you guys think about how an election would play out between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan in 1976, and if you agree or disagree with some of the things I said and a lot of the projections that I made. Anyway, thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you all later. Bye.